You probably think owning a gas station means owning a machine that prints money every time someone pulls up and fills their tank. Gas is expensive, people need it constantly, and the pump never really stops running. It feels like one of the safest businesses you could own.
It isn't. On most gallons of gasoline sold in the United States, the station owner keeps somewhere in the range of a few cents to maybe 15 or 20 cents of profit. And during volatile weeks, that number can flip negative. The person filling up at pump 4 is, in a very real sense, not where the money comes from. Understanding why reveals something almost nobody expects about how this entire industry actually survives.
Start with the version most people carry around in their head. A station owner buys fuel from a distributor at wholesale price, marks it up, and sells it to drivers. More cars, more gallons, more profit. Simple supply and demand, just like a lemonade stand, with a bigger price tag. Under that mental model, a busy station on a busy road should be a guaranteed cash machine.
That model breaks almost immediately once you look at how fuel is actually priced. Wholesale gasoline prices move by the hour, tied to crude oil markets, refinery output, regional pipeline capacity, and taxes that vary by state and even by county. Retail pump prices, by contrast, tend to move slowly and get compared constantly by drivers checking apps and driving an extra block to save a few cents. That mismatch, fast-moving wholesale cost against slow-moving, fiercely competitive retail price, is where the owner's margin actually lives, and it is much thinner than the sticker price implies.
Before any of that matters, though, there's a barrier to entry most people never picture: what it actually takes to open the station in the first place. You need land in a location with enough traffic to matter, which usually means paying a premium for a corner lot on a busy road, often one of the most expensive types of commercial real estate per square foot in a given area, because visibility and easy turn-in access are scarce. You need underground storage tanks, which are expensive to install and, as we'll get to, expensive in a different and much scarier way over time. And in most cases, you need a fuel supply agreement with a major brand, Shell, Exxon, BP, or a regional equivalent, which typically comes with requirements about signage, hours, minimum purchase volumes, and sometimes a franchise-style fee structure. None of that shows up in the fantasy version of buy low, sell high.
So the owner is now carrying land debt, tank installation costs, branding obligations, and a supply contract that dictates a meaningful chunk of how the business runs before a single car has pulled in.
Here's the number that changes how you see everything else. Industry trade groups that track convenience retailing have reported for years that fuel sales typically make up the large majority of a station's revenue, but only a small fraction of its actual profit. Meanwhile, the inside of the store, the fountain drinks, the snacks, the coffee, the cigarettes, the lottery tickets, generates a much smaller share of revenue, but a dramatically larger share of the profit. That gap is the whole story. Fuel brings the traffic. The store is where the business actually gets paid.
This is the point where the picture flips. It looks like a fuel business. Economically, it functions like a convenience retailer that happens to have a very effective, very expensive form of advertising sitting out front, the pump. The gasoline isn't the product being sold for profit. It's the hook that gets a car to slow down, pull in, and put a human being within 20 feet of a cooler full of energy drinks with a 60, 70, sometimes 80% margin. The driver who fills up and drives away without walking inside is financially close to a wash for the owner. The driver who fills up and buys a coffee, a snack, and a pack of cigarettes is where the real transaction happens.
That reframing also explains something that used to seem strange: why stations so often compete aggressively on gas price, sometimes pricing fuel at break-even or even a small loss for a period, especially near a competitor. If gas were the actual profit engine, that would be irrational. But if gas is functioning as a loss-leading traffic generator for a retail store, undercutting a competitor on fuel price to pull cars onto your lot instead of theirs starts to make a lot more sense. You're not selling gasoline at a loss, you're paying for foot traffic, and gasoline happens to be the currency you're paying it in. Now, add the part that makes this business meaningfully riskier than most retail: what's buried under the parking lot. Underground storage tanks hold thousands of gallons of a flammable, environmentally hazardous liquid sitting in the ground, often for decades. If a tank corrodes, cracks, or was installed improperly, it can leak fuel into the surrounding soil and groundwater without anyone noticing for years, since the leak is invisible from street level. When a leak is discovered, during an inspection, a tank replacement, or when a well test comes back contaminated, the cleanup obligation can run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes more, depending on how far the contamination has spread and what it's threatening, like a nearby water supply. This isn't a rare edge case dreamed up to scare you. It's common enough that it fundamentally reshaped the industry once, and we'll get to exactly how in a moment.
This is also where insurance and regulation quietly become one of the biggest ongoing costs of the business. Owners typically need specialized environmental liability coverage on top of standard commercial insurance, along with regular tank testing and monitoring to stay compliant with state and federal rules. None of that generates a dollar of revenue. All of it is the price of being allowed to keep operating. So picture the full chain now, because this is where individual pressures start compounding into something bigger. Crude oil prices spike due to a geopolitical event or a refinery outage. Wholesale fuel costs jump within days. The station owner faces a choice: raise pump prices immediately and risk losing price-sensitive drivers to the station across the street, or hold prices steady and absorb a shrinking, sometimes negative margin on every gallon sold during the lag. Most owners split the difference, which means margin compression either way. That squeezed fuel margin increases the pressure on the inside of the store to carry more of the business's actual profit. But store traffic isn't infinite, and it isn't guaranteed. More people are also buying snacks and coffee at big box retailers, ordering them for delivery, or simply driving electric vehicles that never need to stop at a station at all. So the traffic that's supposed to rescue the margin is itself under a separate longer-term threat. Independent owners without the buying power of a large chain, who can't negotiate as good a wholesale fuel rate, and who don't have the marketing and loyalty program infrastructure to keep customers walking inside, feel every part of that squeeze more sharply than the big chains do. Over time, this pushes weaker independent operators towards selling out, converting to a big brand franchise model, or closing entirely. That chain reaction isn't hypothetical. Something close to it already happened once at massive scale, and it's the clearest case study for how fragile this business model can be underneath a fuel pump that looks perfectly ordinary from the street. In 1988, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency finalized regulations targeting underground storage tanks, requiring owners to upgrade or replace tanks that didn't meet new leak detection and corrosion protection standards, with compliance deadlines phased in through the following years. On paper, this was straightforward environmental policy. Old steel tanks corrode, corroded tanks leak, and leaking tanks contaminate groundwater. So the fix was to require better tanks and better monitoring. For a large branded chain with hundreds of locations and access to capital, upgrading tanks was a manageable, if expensive, cost of doing business. For a small, independently owned station, often a single location, sometimes family-run for decades, the upgrade cost could rival or exceed what the entire business was worth. Many of these owners had no realistic way to finance the work. The result was a wave of closures and buyouts across independent gas stations through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, as thousands of small operators either shut down, sold their land, or sold their business to a larger brand that could absorb the compliance cost. The corner store, family-owned gas station, the version most people still picture when they imagine this business, became far less common, and the branded chain station with an attached convenience store became the default. This is a large part of why the modern gas station looks the way it does, not because independent ownership stopped being profitable in theory, but because a single regulatory shift exposed how thin the margin for error already was, and only the operators with real financial depth survived it intact. That episode proves the underlying mechanism we've been building toward. The visible business, pumps, a sign, a price per gallon, was never the whole picture. Underneath it was a fragile structure of thin fuel margins, dependent store traffic, and a hidden environmental liability that could turn an ordinary asset into a financial trap overnight. When the regulatory floor moved, that fragility became impossible to hide. The industry adapted, and the adaptation tells you exactly what it learned from that experience. Large retailers, like warehouse clubs and big box chains, started offering fuel as a loyalty perk for members, openly running gas as a loss leader to drive store and membership traffic, rather than pretending it was a profit center at all. The logic we uncovered earlier just made explicit instead of hidden. Convenience store chains leaned harder into food service, building out fresh food, coffee programs, and even quick-service restaurant tie-ins inside the store, because that's where the margin lives, and food carries far better margins than snacks alone. Branded fuel companies consolidated further, since scale means better wholesale fuel pricing, better financing for tank compliance, and more leverage in supply negotiations. All the advantages an independent single-location owner structurally lacks. And more recently, some station operators have started experimenting with EV charging, not because it currently replaces fuel profit in any meaningful way, but as a hedge against a future where the traffic-generating pump at the front of the lot might not be gasoline at all.
So what does actually happen if you buy a gas station today? And how does that play out across the range of outcomes? In the best case, you own the land outright or on very favorable terms. You're in a high-traffic location with weak nearby competition. Your tanks are new enough that compliance isn't an imminent cost. And your convenience store does real volume in food and drinks rather than just gas and cigarettes. In that scenario, the business can be genuinely profitable. And, importantly, the real estate underneath it, in a good location, tends to appreciate on its own regardless of how the fuel margin behaves week to week. Some of the most successful station owners aren't really running a fuel business at all in their own minds. They're running a convenience retail business on valuable land that happens to also sell gas. In the realistic, more typical case, you're managing thin and unpredictable fuel margins, competing hard on price with nearby stations, relying on the inside store to cover a meaningful share of your actual profit, and budgeting for insurance, compliance, and eventual tank work as an ongoing cost rather than a rare emergency. It's a viable small business, but it's a demanding one, closer to running a convenience store with a very complicated and expensive front yard than to running a simple fuel dispensary.
In the realistic negative case, wholesale prices spike at the wrong time. A nearby competitor undercuts you on price for an extended stretch. Store traffic softens because of a new EV-owning demographic or a big box competitor down the road. And a routine tank inspection turns up a compliance issue you can't easily finance. Any one of those alone is survivable. 2 or 3 of them arriving close together is close to what pushed thousands of independent owners out of the business the last time the ground shifted under this industry. Literally.
So, go back to the assumption you probably started with, that owning a gas station means owning a machine that profits every time gas gets sold. It doesn't work that way, and understanding why changes what the business actually is. A gas station is not primarily a fuel business. It's a real estate and convenience retail business that uses gasoline as a loss-leading traffic generator, wrapped around a serious, sometimes invisible environmental liability sitting in the ground beneath it. The pump is the advertisement, the store is the business, the land is often the real long-term asset, and the tanks underneath it all are the quiet risk that once in the industry's history was large enough to reshape who gets to own this kind of business at all.